Welcome to the Digging Deeper Bible Study with Pastor Lewis Cooper on the campus of Unity Baptist Church in Bon Air, Georgia. Join us now as we begin our study on the book of Genesis.
Most of your life, you've been in God's Word. You're very familiar with this chapter because this is the infamous chapter about Sarai and Hagar. But I would go ahead and make this statement ahead of time. I feel like from my journey being exposed to this passage, it was often the point of this section was completely missed. We often will focus more on Hagar and the situation there, but actually what we're going to see tonight is that the story itself actually sets up a setting for the message of this chapter in this ongoing historical narrative in the life of Abram. And remember, the whole point of Scripture is for God to reveal Himself and His will. And so as we move through this section, try to keep that in mind, because again, it's not so much about Abram, it's not so much about Sarai, it's not so much about Hagar, it's much about God. Because He's the one that shines in this, as we'll see as we make our way through it. So I've entitled tonight's discussion talk on this chapter as Unbelief, the Rebuke to Remember. Because again, this chapter is the epitome of what we can expect and the consequence of unbelief. With that, I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. Rather than kind of go through and give you some points that sort of summarizes that particular verse, this is a very good chapter because A, it's not too long, but B, the sections are so obvious that it lets us approach this from a again, historical narrative and look at it from a more of a, not a grammatical way, but more of a literal way of seeing how the Holy Spirit led Moses to lay this out. And we're going to see how the structure itself actually serves toward us getting the message of this account in the life of Abram's family, his wife and her maidservant, and actually in the history of redemption. So we start out with, like I said, structure provides the setting for the story. The circumstance, we're going to come right out of verse 1, is that Sarah is still barren. Okay, the promise has been made, the covenant has been set, that Abram was going to be the father of a great nation, but yet she still remains barren. So the two movements that we're going to see, or two sections, are going to be from verses 1 through 6 and then verses 7 through 16. So we'll spend some time on 1 through 6 because there's two parallel movements in those verses, and then we're going to have a dialogue in section 2 between Hagar and the angel of the Lord. And so we'll be looking at that a little bit more closer. So, two sections, verses 1 through 6, verses 7 through 16. So, I want to read for us, starting with verse 1, through the first section, and then we will start looking at the two parallel movements in that particular section. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, and perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went in to Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. So, again, this is probably not new to most of you in here, this encounter and how all this went down. But I want to kind of walk through these two movements, and I apologize for my slide. It obviously is off. But section 1, as I said, has two parallel movements. One is that Sarah is barren. And what we can see there is there is a tension. So much so that the second movement we're going to see is where Sarai gives Hagar to Abram. She conceives, and now Sarai despises Hagar. And also, Hagar is taking issue with Sarah. She's taking attitude because now she was the maidservant, but now she's a wife who's going to have Abram's heir. And so she's feeling a little bit better about her station in life. So, with that being the case, I want to break down our first section and the first movement. And I apologize, my slides are all hinky up. But anyway, verse 1 through 4, we see that Sarah's barren. The consequence of that is that custom was she could take her maidservant, give it to her husband, and through her have children that were legally hers. So we already saw last time that Abram had already had in his mind that the servant, the head servant born in his family, was going to be his heir. God said no. What did God tell him? He's going to come from your body. So again, looks like this is a solution. Even though Sarah's not involved, it is coming from Abram's body. However, we know, knowing more of the story, that that wasn't what God was intending, because Sarai was Abram's wife. And we'll see in coming chapters how that works out, as we already are sure. But the interesting thing to see is in verse 2. In verse 2, Sarah said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." So who is she blaming? She's blaming God. Because again, in their belief, and as well as we know, God is the giver and the taker of life. We know all the stories we hear about in false religions, the fertility gods. Again, they try to appease the gods to have an abundant crop, for you to have plenty of children. But they look to the gods to provide for them. And what we can see is an underlying truth here that we're going to unpack more in a moment, is that Sarah is acknowledging the dependence we have on our Creator. Because she was barren, and really that theme of barrenness under the law was a sign that you were under judgment. But we can't bring that into this text because has the law been given yet? No. But again, for whatever reason, as she acknowledges, the Lord has closed my womb. And we see this all the way through the patriarchs, actually. We see this kind of ongoing, and even into the prophets, because you remember Hannah? But we see a whole different attitude with Hannah than we do with Sarah, don't we? Because Hannah just appealed to the Lord, but she never tried to usurp the Lord, as we see Sarah did here, as she was seeking to blame God. And again, that's the human nature. We got to blame somebody, right? We go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. Here we got Adam at the fall. What did he say to God? "The woman whom you gave to me, she gave me from the tree and I ate." So again, Adam's blaming God. And we know before this, Eve was blaming the serpent. And so again, there's that blame game that's constantly going on. But as the story continues to progress, the handmaiden is given as a surrogate wife to Abram. And we see this in verse 22 as well as incorporating verse 3. Verse 3 gives us a little chronological marker that's going to be important, especially moving into chapter 17. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Now we'll stop there, because how long has Abram lived with the promise of an heir? Well, he's been in Canaan for 10 years. So he's had the journey from Ur to there. Now, again, the covenant's been reaffirmed. So from a human perspective, how would you feel about the promise? Nothing's happening. So, a lot of times it's easy for us to take a perspective of kind of throwing rocks at the biblical characters in the narrative. But again, they're human beings just like we are. And so we get impatient. And again, I think that's one of the things that we see here with Sarah, because it puts her in a tough spot, because she is Abram's wife. She is the one that should be producing the heir, but it's not happening. And so again, when she comes up with this idea for Hagar, then it really is about to backfire in her face. But the thing we need to see before we move to the second movement is in the first part of verse 4. Abram does what?
He does what he's told.
Okay. Does that sounds familiar, doesn't it? If we go back to Genesis again, chapter 3 at the fall, what did God say to Adam? Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded who? You. So again, let's stop right there. Who received the promise first person? Abram. So again, it's easy to throw it off on Sarah. Well, this is what you want. This is what I'm going to do. But wait. No, God said it was going to be from your body. So again, he acted in a very human way. So again, he conceded, and probably in his humanness, actually it has been 10 years, and it is customary for this to be done. Maybe this is what God meant. So again, trying to interpret just what God had in mind. It is coming from my body, so maybe this is what God meant. But we know the rest of the story. But before we leave that, for those who want to say, see, this is where guys need to be careful about listening to their wives. God told Abram in chapter 21, which is another significant chapter with Hagar in there, because they were fixing to kick her and Ishmael out. But again, God steps in and says, do not distress because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall come. Now this is a new tension that I'm sort of throwing in here ahead of time. But in chapter 21, it looks like the tension is resolved because Abram has an heir by Sarah, but yet the tension still is there because Ishmael is 13 years older than Isaac. And you think Abram has a bond with Ishmael? Yeah. Oh yeah. It's still his son. But now Sarah's wanting him out because she doesn't like how the relationship of the siblings are working out, and the whole tension of two families under one roof with the same daddy. That's entertainment today for some people, these multiple wives in one house and all that kind of stuff, sister wives and all this whatever. But this is why it doesn't work. We're human beings, and the relationship between a man and a woman in a marriage is to be that. And when you bring in other parts, such as another wife or family dynamic, you can have some very strong challenges. So God tells Abram in chapter 21, you listen to Sarah. So in other words, she wants them out, you do what she says, which sounds kind of odd, but yet it sets up an opportunity for God to show he's going to fulfill what we're going to see in a moment, what he told Hagar. And then we'll intervene again. So in the second movement of section 1, we have, picking up in the latter part of verse 4, Hagar has conceived, but now the relationship has really gotten bad because now verses 5 and 6, she is in a place of, she's moved up the ladder. She's now among the maidservants. She's not just a maidservant. She is Abram's surrogate wife who has conceived. And so literally what we have here is Sarah's fruit of unbelief. Because who set up this equation? Sarah did. Wasn't Abram, wasn't God. It was Sarah in her impatience. Set this up, and things began to go in a different way. Literally what we could see is that the plan went awry, literally. So, from there, now look at verse 5. Sarah, who does she blame? Now it's Abram's fault. We got to blame somebody. So he says, so may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms. In other words, I did this for you. But when she saw that she had conceived, that's Hagar, had conceived, now she despises Sarah. So really what you got now is Sarah's pride has been bruised. Because Hagar is saying, the relationship's different. I'm not your maidservant. Don't talk down at me. Another scripture, I'm kind of injecting this. I'm just thinking about the dynamic of humanity. You can just imagine how Hagar now, when Sarah says, could you go get this for me? Who are you talking to? Not talking to me. Oh, I'm carrying Abram's child, heir. He's been waiting for, that God said he was going to have from his body. So you're not talking to me. Well, how's Sarah going to respond to that? She's going to be angry. She's going to be very angry. So she's blaming Abram, says, now, may the Lord judge between you and me. And so we get to verse 6. I'll move ahead a little bit. Latter part of verse 5, Abram gives Sarah the decision because, after all, she's still your maidservant. So you decide what you're going to do with her. And then when you get to verse 6, Abram gives Hagar back to Sarah to decide, what are you going to do with her? So at this point, it looks very familiar to what we're going to see later once Ishmael's born. But now, he's give her back to Sarah. And so with the tension in the relationship, it's still unresolved. But look at verse 6, because there's a word in there that's interesting, a play on words. It says, but Abram said to Sarah, behold, your maidservant is in your power, and she's still your property. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly. Now that word there in the Hebrew is hana, to treat harshly or to afflict. And literally it's such abrasive, it also can be used in the Hebrew language for rape. I'm not saying that Sarah raped Hagar, but yet just abuse, just constant abuse, and oppressed her. Treated her harshly is the way the New American Standard translated this. But the interesting thing is, if you go back to chapter 15 and verse 13, it's the same word that God used when he told Abram about your descendants are going to be 400 years in another nation, and they're going to be enslaved and oppressed. Our English Bible translates this oppressed, but it's the same word. They're going to be abused. So now God's telling Abram, your descendants, who are going to be what eventually will be called Jews, are going to be harshly treated by Egyptians. But what do we have in chapter 16? We got Sarai, who in later centuries would be called a Jew, treating harshly who? An Egyptian woman. So it's an interesting flip there, and we see this kind of going on through the rest of the narratives that we're going to see. There is this underlying connection there. Scripture I just read, be oppressed for 400 years. So again, Sarah has treated her harshly. Now with that, we move to the second section. Kind of say, well, where do we just left that there? Well, what does it say at the end of verse 6? And she fled from her presence. Hagar ran away. She got out of Dodge because, again, she had taken all that she could take. Now, culturally, if she, as a maidservant, she was the property of Sarah and she ran away, that didn't set well culturally. It put her really in jeopardy. But she'd had enough. She would rather run away, and to heighten the game, she's not just running away herself to get away from the treatment, but who's she taking with her? The heir. Well, that should make the camp a little uneasy, shouldn't you think? So Abram's probably not real excited about that. But in this second section, we have this wilderness dialogue. And it is between Hagar and the angel of the Lord. And actually, verse 7, when we get Hagar has been running in the wilderness, and we find her in verse 7 at a well or a spring on her way to Shur. Now, some may think she was running back to Egypt or she was just running away. I think, we don't know, but she was just getting out of Dodge. She was running away, far as she could go. It would be a little strange if she tried to get all the way back to Egypt all by herself. But literally, she was also putting herself in jeopardy. Because what do you think the wilderness is going to do to this young lady who is with child? It's not going to be good. There's not going to be a hotel down here that she can go to, or she can bring out a credit card and rent a room or stop by and get something at the fast food. I mean, literally, she is showing her dependency. And again, there's an underlying principle here that we're going to come back to. But the dependency that Hagar was as a human being in the elements put her life in jeopardy. She needed help. And so what do we have in verse 7, which actually sort of turns the tide toward actually what this chapter is about? Now the angel of the Lord found her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And then, verse 7, we have this reminder of what God is doing. He's up to something because it's the angel of the Lord. So the question comes up, is this a theophany? A theophany. A theophany is often referred to a pre-incarnate appearance of who we would know as Jesus in the New Testament, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. The challenge we have with nailing that down for sure here is that we really lack anything that says he appeared. In verse 7, we saw that he found her. There's no inference that he was actually on the scene or came and saw her there, but he was aware of where she was at. And that's significant to play into the message of this section. So, verse 8, he asked her a question. Hagar, Sarah's maid, again, notice identity. Where have you come from and where are you going? Now, if it was the Lord, if it's God, wouldn't he know? Sure, but again, we don't need to negate that as being evidence that, well, this isn't God speaking, because he would know. And maybe the angels, they aren't omniscient, so they wouldn't know everything. But I think really what you have here, again, is sort of a parallel of what we saw when God asked Adam, where are you? You know, because did God know where he was? Yeah. Sure he did. But again, he was bringing it to the point, I want you to acknowledge that you're hiding from me. And then that sets up the follow-up question, who told you he was naked? And so for her, she next has to say, in verse 8, Sarah's maid, where have you come from? Where are you going? She says, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarah. So I'm trying to get away from her oppressive hand. But then we move a little bit further. What he says in verse 9, he tells her to do what? Return and submit. Now, do you think that was what she wanted to hear? She'd been a lot better off, in her mind, if he just gave her something to eat and maybe something to keep her warm in the night. But he's given her instruction. The angel of the Lord, the messenger of God, is bringing her a word. I want you to return. All right, well, she's a runaway servant. So what does she have to look forward to when she gets back? Punishment. And then he tells her, not just that, I want you to submit to her authority. Now, a lot of people would take that and just run with it, but I think we have to be careful how much we read into the text. But he's telling her to run back, well, not to run, but to go back to Sarah and basically repent and be obedient to who you are. Well, then it moves talking about the angel of the Lord. Verse 9 through 10, he's bringing her this word. And then in verse 10, he says to her, moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will. And that's the key phrase. Remember, we kind of keep harping on that through our walk through Genesis. I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. Now, that sounds familiar. First of all, he's telling her, her descendants, her womb, the child she's carrying is going to be one that's going to be the beginning of many. But notice who's going to be doing the work behind it again? God. And up to this point, has God done that for Abram? No, but he's promised. He said he was going to do it. And now he's telling Hagar that he's going to do this. And then in verse 11, he gets prophetic. Verse 11 and 12, he says, the angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child. Some would say, well, she knew that. And you will bear a son. Now, she didn't know that. She has a son. Now, that's significant. Because if it had been a girl, what would that mean for Abram's heir? Yeah, kind of that's not going to work out. But, nope, God gave her a son. And you shall call his name Ishmael. Ishmael. Now, we hear that name today, and it was common in there, and it wasn't like it's brand new. But it still sort of brings up a whole different set of thoughts running away from God's people. Because we know that the descendants of Ishmael were the sons of Arab, and who eventually we know that Islam came from that group. And this is long before Islam, so we can't blame it on him per se, but yet it's through his descendants that we have the third largest world religion in the world today, who say they believe in God, which our conversation Sunday in our life group. But again, we know it's not the God of the Bible. They believe Abraham is their father. And is that true? Absolutely, yeah. But the interesting thing, because again, we start running down that rabbit trail, but again, that's not what this chapter is about. What does Ishmael's name mean? God hears. Now we get into the point of the story. God hears. So she returns to her mistress. And in verse 13 through 15, well, let me read the rest of the prophecy. Let me back up. Verse 12. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers. So again, people read a lot into that, but we know that there are people, a lot of contention, very nomadic, wanderers, but at the same time very tribal and very aggressive. And so literally this is kind of what he's talking about here. And again, don't read so much into the metaphor of the wild donkey of a man. He's just going to be an unruly, stubborn, determined individual. And we can kind of see that go along with their culture. But then Sarah comes back in, verse 13 and 14. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Now, some have put a lot of thought into Sarah or Hagar calling or seeing God in this name, how she spoke to him. I don't think it was any of y'all, but somebody made comment one time to me that she was the one that first called God by name. Well, that's not what the scripture says. She used the name when she spoke of, if you'll notice in verse 13, the Lord, all caps, Yahweh. So in her encounter with the angel of the Lord, with the word of the Lord, she saw the Lord and called him, you are a God who sees, or El Roi is the word that's used in the original language. What she's really saying here, and the way the original is written, is that she's saying, I have seen him, and because I have seen him, I'm alive. Because she was in danger of her life. She was in the wilderness. And yes, she was by a spring that gave her the water, but again, night's coming, it gets cold in the desert at night. It doesn't say there's food there for her to eat. She's still exposed to the elements, the heat of the day, the cool of the night. But because God sees her in her distress, she's alive. And then she goes on to say in verse 14, she names the well, the spring. It's called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And again, literally what it means is that the well of the living one who sees me. So again, she's naming the well as a reminder of what God did there. So with that name, when other people come, they're going to be reminded that this is where Hagar was ministered to by the Lord, but also the prophecy was spoken that even in her turmoil, God was doing a work. Even in the tension and the hurt that she had experienced, God was doing a work. And because of that, she got to see a real glimpse of God. Tozer made this comment one time, and it's really hard for us to process this one. He says that God will hurt us deeply for us to know Him. Now, that's not what we want to hear. But it's true. Because when do we see God the clearest? In our time of suffering or turmoil or anguish. And we're seeing that illustrated here in the life of Hagar. But again, notice another thing. Hagar, what's her nationality? She's Egyptian. Is she of the elect? No. So it shows us that God isn't just working with the elect. God is doing a work even amongst His people, or those outside His people, to accomplish His will. And again, we see now the descendants of Ishmael have literally led to a people that have a religion that has, in the extreme sense, I'll put it this way, has become literally a thorn in the side of a world that would love to have peace. They're a very dominating religion. Conquest. They don't spread by sharing a good news and praying for their God to do a work in the individual to receive by faith. No, it is by force. It is to conquer and force people to accept their beliefs. And if you don't, like happened to the Christian workers, I think it was in Nigeria yesterday or today, 3 of them were killed. And the reason that they were killed by these extremists was because they're infidels. They deserve to die. That's their mentality. Just killed them like a dog. They're infidels. But again, God's working through all of that. To do what? To reveal Himself and to help us to remember. And so I want to go to some truths that we can pull out, because verse 15 and 16 sort of summarizes the chapter. So Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And again, that lets us know Hagar went back to Abram and told him what? What God told her. Now, is this sort of a twist of events? Up to this point, who's Abram been getting the word of the Lord from? No, from the Lord. But now, because of his lack of belief, listen to his wife. Now, the maidservant, the Egyptian, is bringing him the word of the Lord. And he has this son, Ishmael, which again reminds him right in his face all the time. What does Ishmael mean? God hears. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So, this takes us to 3 truths that I want us to see that this story brings out. Because again, the message of the angel of the Lord was that God sees, God hears. Now, is that something we need to remember? Yes. Because this is a solid truth going all the way back to the beginning of Genesis and our creation by God. God wants us to see with our eyes. He wants us to see and accept. And to me, this is key. We have no problem saying God sees and hears, but we need to accept the fact that because of who He is and who we are dependent on Him. He made us this way. We don't like it in our pride, but going to the garden, before Adam and Eve rebelled, Adam and Eve knew nothing but good. Why could they have nothing? Let me rephrase this. Why was that setting so such a contrast to what God was saying? Do not eat of this tree. And when the enemy said, if you eat of this tree, you're going to be like God. But God's concern was, after they did, that now they know what? Good and evil. And again, the point was, now they know there's a consequence when it's not good. And because things now were not good, it was because of their sin or their disobedience. Before their fall, the environment was all good. It was wonderful. But again, what made it wonderful was they were in God's bosom, so to speak. They were in His care. And as long as they honored Him for that, they would know nothing but good. But as soon as they partake of the tree of knowledge, their eyes would be open. That there's a consequence. That there is another side. And that side is not doing things in accordance to Yahweh, which has consequences. And so this story, Abram was learning to be dependent upon who for the heir? God. But yet, time had passed, a decision or an opportunity was placed before him. We got an idea, we got a solution. Now, culture says it's acceptable for you to take my maiden, have a child with her, and that child will be your heir. Problem solved. But Abram now has learned, because he became taking an initiative of his own, listening to his wife, and it's not all Sarah, because like Adam, what did Abram do? He didn't listen to the Lord. He didn't believe what the Lord said. God said, you will be. I'm going to do this. I've made a covenant with you. But enough time had passed, he began to not have the same conviction. And so rather than being dependent and waiting upon the promise to be filled, what does he do? He goes independent, does what seems to be acceptable, which takes us to the second truth. Impatience is fertile soil for unbelief. I'll be the first to admit I am not the most patient individual. There is a reason it's referred to as a virtue. Because literally when we're patient, who do we show a greater dependence upon? On a sovereign God. And I have to remind myself of that. I did that today. I was in a line and I was like, this person was some reason they were very slow. And, and I just kind of laid my head back and said, it's all right, God. You're sovereign. You got this. There's nothing happens in this world that you don't say is okay, or I'm at work. Trust me. And I had to just keep telling myself that, because my flesh was wanting to, instead of being dependent upon God's rule, I wanted to step into the seat of authority and make some decisions here that somebody need to make a move. Either I need to get in another lane, I need to do something, but something's got to give. But the Lord won, because I just sat there and I waited, and about the time I got ready, just like, really? What happened? They got out of the way. Praise Jesus. But, again, that's an everyday occurrence for us. And so what was happening in Abram's life and Sarah's life was they were learning to wait upon the Lord. The scripture is clear. Those that wait upon the Lord shall what? Renew their strength. And where does that come from? Their faith in Him. I like what Dr. Ross said. I just put this in the slide. He said, once patient waiting was abandoned for human calculation, once patient waiting was abandoned for human calculations, then natural impulses, i.e. your flesh, and right conduct become entangled. And the participants had no control once this process was set in motion, for it led to conflict. That's what this story is telling us. Of all the people that were to wait upon the promise of the Lord, those who knew God had been faithful, because up to this point, had God favored Abram? Indeed. But enough time had passed, and then a circumstance arose to where, culturally we could do this and solve this issue. And now the story goes through complete lack of control and conflict. So the third truth that we see then in this account is that God wants us to know. He wants us to know He sees. Now, there's not a one of us here that would say God doesn't see all. But we need to remind ourselves of that. He is a sovereign God, and He hears us. And the reason He has revealed that to us here is so that we will remember He cares for us. Abram, and remember we talked about this before, what we see in these historical narratives is God revealing Himself through the life instances of the biblical characters. You would think after this, the time with Sarai and the Pharaoh, with Abram going into battle and defeating these kings, showing faithfulness, that he wouldn't take the spoil from the king of Sodom, so he didn't want the king of Sodom to ever say he made Abram rich. He was depending upon the Lord. And another time passes, and where are we at? How quickly we forget. So, unbelief and the rebuke of that unbelief is what we need to remember. That unbelief and us stepping outside the will of God is always going to lead to conflict. But when we walk with the Lord, we will have peace of mind. Not necessarily mean you're going to be at peace all the time, because we remember we walk against the current of a godless world and culture. We've been told that the world's going to hate us and kill some of us, drag us to court. And John brings out in his first epistle that, you need to expect the world not to like you because you're the children of God. What do you expect? God is not of this world. So again, as heirs of God, as His siblings, as His children, not siblings, but as His children, we literally need to expect this kind of resistance. But our battle more often is with ourselves than it is with our culture. We like to blame it off on the culture, the world, Satan, but really our greatest enemy is ourself. So this rebuke that brought conflict because of their unbelief is something that Abram and Sarah were meant to remember. And we need to remember millennia later. But it's interesting because as we go through Genesis some more, we're going to find even more and more accounts of where they're slipping back into that unbelief. Now, in one side of the coin, that should encourage us, because in our weak moments of faith, we're right in there with amongst the great biblical characters. But at the second, it also reminds us, when are we going to believe what we know to be the truth about our God? And I think that will only come as we get to know Him better. And the sad struggle for us is that to know Him better will mean we will have times of conflict, anxiety, stress, challenges, because it is only in those times that we find that we are out of control, we can't do anything about it, that we look to the one who's always in control. But it doesn't have to be that way. But what that lets us know is that's some of the reasons why things happen in this world like they do. Because what God is doing is to reveal Himself and to remind us that since the fall, whenever man decided, I'm going to do it my way, God has let the rebuke of the fall and the consequence of the fall be a constant reminder every time we see what we're seeing. We as children of God, believers of Scripture, we should back up and say, I understand why. God wants us to see sin is serious. There's a consequence to sin. And the only solution to sin is Jesus, which brings us in a right relationship with our Creator, so that we can taste and see that God is good. But we have to be reminded and be reminded and be reminded, because we struggle with unbelief, just like Sarah and Abram. But then God would use some of the most strange opportunities to remind us, like he did with Abram, Hagar coming to him, the Lord told me. What? He spoke to you, handmaiden, outcast of my family? Yep. And he said. Questions? Sorry about the slide mix up there.